The night he was finally caught, the woman in the motel room was still alive. She was bound to the bed in a cheap room in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey, her wrists cuffed, her body burned and cut, the air thick with cigarette smoke and fear. Outside, Route 17 hummed with traffic, neon signs blinking like indifferent witnesses. The man who called himself a husband and father had left the room for a moment. He thought he had time. He thought he had control. He had always had control. But this time, someone heard her. This time, the police came before he could finish what he started. And when they opened that door, they stepped into the private theater of one of America's most methodical and sadistic serial killers, Richard Cottingham. He looked ordinary. That was part of the design. Born in 1946 in the Bronx, raised in River Vale, New Jersey, Cottingham grew up in post-war suburbia, the kind of quiet streets where neighbors waved and lawns were trimmed in straight lines. He was described as shy, intelligent, good with numbers. He later worked as a computer operator for a large insurance company in Manhattan, a job that required precision and patience. By the late 1960s, he was married. He would go on to have 3 children. To co-workers and neighbors, he was stable, reserved, a little withdrawn perhaps, but harmless. But as the 1970s unfolded, a decade of urban decay, rising crime, and flickering Times Square marquees, Cottingham began living a second life. He spent nights driving into New York City, particularly Times Square, which in those days was a landscape of adult theaters, peep shows, and street prostitution. The glow of porn cinemas reflected off rain-slicked pavement. Pimps lingered in doorways. Runaways and sex workers negotiated survival in a city that rarely noticed when they vanished. Cottingham noticed. His pattern, at least at first, was simple. He would approach women working the streets, often young, sometimes addicted, sometimes estranged from family, and offer money for sex. He presented as clean-cut, soft-spoken. He would rent motel rooms in New Jersey or Manhattan, pay in cash, and lead them inside. What happened next was hidden behind thin walls and locked doors. Over time, his violence escalated. In December 1967, a 29-year-old woman named Diane Cusick was found dead in a stairwell at a shopping mall in Paramus, New Jersey. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted. At the time, investigators had no idea that they were looking at the first known victim of a man who would later be dubbed the Torso Killer. The case went cold for decades. DNA technology did not yet exist. There were no surveillance cameras, no digital footprints. Just a body, a grieving family, and silence. Through the 1970s, that silence deepened. In 1977, the remains of 2 women were discovered in separate locations in New York. Both had been dismembered, heads and hands removed, bodies burned in attempts to destroy identification. The brutality was shocking even in a city accustomed to violence. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with someone methodical. Removing heads and hands suggested an effort to delay identification. Burning suggested knowledge and understanding of forensic limitations of the time. The press would eventually call him the Torso Killer because of what he left behind: bodies stripped of identity, reduced to fragments. One of the most chilling crime scenes was uncovered in December 1979 at the Travel Inn Motor Hotel in Manhattan. A maid entered room 417 after guests failed to check out. Inside, she found a horror scene: 2 women dead, their bodies severely mutilated and burned. Their hands had been severed. Their heads were missing. Blood soaked the mattress. The smell of smoke clung to the air. The killer had used the room like a laboratory. He had tortured them for hours. Cigarette burns marked their skin. He had photographed some of his victims in other crimes, sometimes keeping trophies. He relished control. He stretched out their suffering, and then he dismantled them. The investigation intensified, but Times Square in the late 1970s was chaotic. Sex workers were often reluctant to speak to police. Many had outstanding warrants or feared retaliation from pimps. The killer exploited that silence. He chose victims he believed would not be immediately missed or whose disappearances would not command headlines. But patterns were forming. Cottingham's crimes often involved motels along major highways in New Jersey and hotels in Manhattan. He preferred weekends when he could claim overtime or business travel. He used his knowledge of computers to manage his time carefully, to construct alibis. He compartmentalized his life with almost clinical discipline. At home, he attended family gatherings, barbecues, school events. At night, he hunted. Psychologists later suggested that his need for domination stemmed from deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and rage. He had reportedly been a bedwetter into adolescence, something criminologists sometimes cite, controversially, as a possible early warning sign when combined with other factors like cruelty or fire setting. There were indications of early fantasies involving bondage and control, but fantasies alone do not create murderers. The transition from thought to action is where the abyss opens. By 1980, Cottingham's violence had intensified. He was no longer content with quick assaults. He wanted prolonged suffering. On May 15, 1980, he checked into the Quality Inn in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey, with a 19-year-old sex worker named Leslie Odell. Inside room 106, he handcuffed her to the bed. He beat her, he cut her, he burned her with cigarettes. He told her she would die. Hours passed, the room filled with the smell of blood and smoke. But Odell fought. At some point, she managed to make noise, enough noise that other guests heard screams. The motel manager called police. When officers arrived, Cottingham had stepped out of the room. He may have gone to his car. He may have thought he had time to finish what he started. But as police knocked and entered, they found Odell barely alive, bound, and severely injured. Cottingham returned to the motel and was arrested on the spot. He did not initially confess to murder. He was charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, and attempted murder, but investigators quickly connected him to other cases. They searched his home and found disturbing evidence: handcuffs, weapons, and items belonging to victims. His name surfaced in connection with the travel in murders. Witnesses placed him in Times Square at critical times. The net tightened. As detectives pieced together motel receipts, witness statements, and forensic evidence, a portrait emerged. A man who had likely killed far more than anyone initially suspected. Under interrogation, Cottingham alternated between silence and chilling candor. He sometimes seemed to relish recounting details. Other times, he withheld information, as if control over the narrative was the last power he possessed. In 1981, he was convicted in New Jersey for the assault of Leslie Odell and sentenced to decades in prison. In 1984, he stood trial in New York for the travel in murders. The prosecution laid out photographs of the crime scene. They described the mutilations, the burns, the calculated removal of identifying features. Jurors listened as medical examiners detailed how the women had been tortured before death. Cottingham was convicted and received a sentence of 25 years to life. For years, that seemed to be the end of the story. He sat in prison, agging. The world outside changed. Times Square was cleaned up in the 1990s, neon replaced with corporate logos and family-friendly attractions. DNA technology advanced. Cold cases were reopened across the country. And then, decades later, Richard Cottingham began to talk. Starting in the 2000s and intensifying in the 2010s, he confessed to numerous additional murders, some dating back to the late 1960s. Detectives from New Jersey and New York visited him in prison. They brought old case files. They showed him photographs. Sometimes he corrected their timelines. Sometimes he provided details only the killer would know. In 2021, He was charged in connection with the 1967 murder of Diane Cusick after DNA evidence linked him to the crime. He eventually pleaded guilty. The family, who had waited more than half a century for answers, finally heard him admit responsibility. By that point, Cottingham had confessed to more than a dozen murders, and investigators believe the true number may be far higher, possibly dozens more. Many victims were never identified. Some were listed as Jane Does, their stories reduced to skeletal remains and case numbers. The nickname Torso Killer captures the physical brutality of his crimes, but it obscures something deeper: the systematic erasure of identity. Removing heads and hands was not just a tactic to avoid detection, it was symbolic. It stripped victims of faces and fingerprints, of names and histories. It turned people into puzzles for police and footnotes in newspapers. In interviews from prison, Cottingham sometimes described his crimes with eerie detachment. He spoke of losing control, of being driven by compulsions. Yet the evidence shows planning, renting rooms, bringing tools, choosing locations. His double life required discipline. He was not a drifter. He had a steady job. He returned home after nights of torture and murder and sat at the breakfast table with his children. The duality haunts true crime history. The idea that horror can coexist with normalcy, that a man who coaches Little League can also dismember strangers, unsettles our need for clear monsters. Cottingham did not fit the cinematic stereotype. He wore glasses, he balanced spreadsheets. For survivors like Leslie Odell, the case was never about mythology. It was about survival. She identified him, she testified. Her voice helped ensure he would never walk free again. Her survival disrupted his pattern, it exposed him. Law enforcement agencies continue to investigate unsolved murders from the 1970s that may be linked to Cottingham. With advances in forensic genealogy and DNA analysis, cold cases once thought unsolvable are being reopened. Detectives have credited his late-life confessions with bringing closure to families who had spent decades in uncertainty. But closure is complicated. In some cases, he provided details that matched evidence. In others, investigators remain cautious, aware that serial offenders sometimes exaggerate to maintain relevance. The line between confession and manipulation can blur. What remains undeniable is the brutality of the confirmed crimes, the travel in room, the severed hands, the burned bodies, the terrified 19-year-old in a New Jersey motel who refused to die quietly. Richard Cottingham will almost certainly die in prison. He has received multiple life sentences. There will be no parole hearing that changes that reality. The man who once prowled Times Square in search of anonymous prey now lives within concrete walls, his world reduced to routines dictated by others. Yet the echoes of his crimes remain in archived case files, in forensic labs, in families who still light candles for daughters and sisters lost in a darker era of the city. The story of the Torso Killer is not just a chronicle of violence. It is a story about vulnerability in a time when certain lives were treated as disposable. It is about how predators exploit invisibility. It is about how technology, DNA swabs preserved for decades, can reach back through time and force a reckoning. And it begins, and perhaps ends, with that motel room door swinging open in 1980 when police interrupted a ritual that had gone on too long. In that moment, the illusion shattered. The double life collapsed. The man who believed he could erase identities was finally identified himself. Behind the ordinary face was a capacity for calculated cruelty that scarred countless lives. And in the fluorescent glare of a motel hallway, the mask slipped, revealing the architect of one of the most disturbing true crime sagas of the 20th century.